facing. And we'll start with a presentation by Maria from the netCommons project in Westminster University on the EU broadband policy and the way it takes into account, or doesn't take into account, community networks.
Okay, good morning everyone. I'm Maria, I'm from the University of Westminster. As Felix said, this panel is specific about regulation. So my presentation is more about setting the context, and then the following speakers will discuss in more detail specific issues. So to discuss the policy context, I have divided telecoms and more recently internet broadband policy into two phases. I will briefly discuss them, and then I will move on to municipal and community networks and end with remarks. So the first phase of telecoms policy, starting roughly in the mid-80s up until the early 2000s. If you remember, the main policy objective at that time was to introduce competition, market liberalization. In the past, telecoms markets were monopoly markets. So competition was the main policy aim, to improve efficiency, create a big market base for European companies, and so on. Investment was expected to come from private entities, private funding. Okay. The second phase, starting around the early 2000s, up until now, a number of things happened that led to a change of thinking and a change of priorities. Evidence that the market had failed to deliver, as Jürgen was just saying. Yes? So it worked. I mean, there was some progress, but not to the extent that was expected originally. And a rethink of policy because of technological convergence, commercialization of the internet, and continuing problems, growing, widening growth, productivity, and competitiveness gap between the EU and its main trading partners. The internet, as we know, has reached a very high political level. You have a number of initiatives, starting with the Lisbon Agenda and more recently the broadband agendas of 2020 and 2025, the European Gigabit Society, and so on. So if you think about these problems, economic growth, productivity, and to a lesser extent social cohesion and so on, broadband internet is the answer. Now, there is a belief that some form of public intervention is a necessity and appropriate. What does that mean? What kind of public intervention? Public intervention is there to promote and facilitate innovation. In this second phase of policy thinking, the main priority is not liberalization, competition. The main priority is innovation. And innovation means broadband internet. To promote innovation, what you need is give economic agents the right incentives to innovate. In other words, to invest in broadband internet. And that means, at least in some quarters, that perhaps allowing oligopolistic and even monopolistic market structures would be okay if they can deliver innovation, broadband internet. So for instance, some arguments voiced by the big industry, Ethno, this is a quote, well, sorry, it's not a quote, it's from one of their policy documents. Old rules need to be abolished, so forget price controls, forget network access regulations, and so on. What the industry is asking is for the rollback of regulation so regulatory holidays, and market consolidation. So bigger is better. I love this quote, and it's from the industry. Why is it a necessity that 2 million Slovenians have more operators than 1 billion Chinese?
Yeah.
So basically, they're asking policymakers to allow these two things that I have highlighted in the name of innovation. Where do municipal networks, and then I'll continue with community networks, come into this picture that I have drawn? First of all, continuing with the industry's view. Ethno is aware of municipal networks. Basically, if municipal networks, and it's the same with community networks, if they have the potential to challenge the competitive conditions of the market, they see them as a risk, and they want regulators, policymakers to do something about that, to address it. In other words, in competitive areas, they see them as distorting competition. Other players have recognized municipal networks. So it's not just the industry, but it's also players like the OECD, the European Union, and there is evidence of municipal networks, such initiatives, from a number of countries within Europe and outside Europe. Community networks, again, they have been recognized, not least by the OECD and the EU. The problem, in a way, is the narrow definition that is being put forward. So they are acknowledged, they are recognized, but they are defined narrowly in terms of their funding. So if funding comes from private citizens, you and I, then that's a community network. But I think so far we have managed to argue, to show you that community networks are much more than that. It's not just about funding, where funding comes from. The other problem is that community networks are seen as gap filling. So they fill in the gaps where you don't have commercial players interested or willing to go, the so-called white areas in EU language. So commercially unattractive areas. And they play a minor role in the overall broadband market. And the question I think we need to address is, are community networks beyond that? Is it just about filling the gaps, or are they much more than that? So for instance, we mentioned that they have certain principles, values, they can arguably respect fundamental rights more, privacy and so on, and promote social cohesion better. One problem with community networks is funding. Who funds them? And here you have state aid rules that can complicate things. If public funding is involved, then it might constitute state aid. So this has not been tested in relation to community networks as far as I'm aware. So I'll end with remarks. There is growing recognition of municipal and community networks, but they are still seen as the exception. Can they go beyond this gap-filling scenario? There are some, a way forward could be a public-community partnership, so municipal networks working with communities. You have to observe the state aid rules. Or to add to this, you could have private partners working with them, perhaps more likely to be accepted, but then what about the values that community networks represent? And this is the final slide, likely reasons for community networks. Well, first of all, as we said, there will always be areas that don't get serviced. This is rural areas, but also informal settlements of migrants and refugees, for instance. But community networks are more than that. They are about open structures, better privacy, autonomy, control, experimentation, and playing with technology, transferring knowledge. And they can deliver more, not just economic, more non-economic benefits in terms of cohesion. That's it from me. Thank you.